Good morning, Dawg Nation. I'm Brandon Adams. This is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans, presented today by Breda Pest Management. I was paid $2.5 million to be here today, but I want you to know it's not because of the money that I'm here. It's because how much I love being around all of you that I've chosen to be here. That's what really matters to me more so than anything else. I say somewhat jokingly. But nonetheless, we're going to have a fun show today, getting into what goes down with Jackson Cantwell yesterday, maybe more importantly, where Georgia goes from here on that. And listen, I think for me, it's really important kind of not to come across like sour grapes-ish about all this, because the truth is, I mean, as a Georgia fan, I am disappointed. Thought that Georgia had a good chance of winning this one. Told you yesterday I thought they would, even with some of the early chatter on Cantwell. Still kind of thought that was a little bit of a red herring, or maybe perhaps an attempt at swerve. It was not, but nonetheless, we're gonna try to figure out where it all goes from here. We'll let you do some of that too. We're also in a good mood today because the Atlanta Braves have gotten their way back to 500 after what was obviously kind of a 0-7, a rough start for them. Now kind of figuring some things out, so you love that. So all kinds of good stuff. UGA Marine says, good luck to Cantwell. Enjoy going 9-3, 10-2 every year with Cristobal. Turn our heads to more important stuff. I mean, look, there is obviously a contrast between Georgia as a program and Miami as a program. And I don't care what anybody tries to say. This is a Miami team that hasn't been to the college ball playoff, has not won the ACC in the time in which they've been in that league. This is a team that's more desperate than Georgia is. And look, you want Georgia to get a player of this magnitude, and yet you know that there's no free lunch, that if you mortgage your future in order to do that, if you pay, an exorbitant fee that you believe is above what your perception of market value is, there's obviously some negatives attached to that. That's one of the reasons why I think Miami pushes back so hard against the narrative that this is just about money. So I think all of that is in bounds and very fair as a part of the conversation here today. Matt Rukavina says, good morning, all. And, Matt, we're glad to have you checking in. It's kind of funny. DawgNation, the comment section looked different. Again, am I the only one who feels this way? Like, totally different than it was earlier. Low Country Dog checking in. Good to see him. Bill Camacho checking in. Good to see him. Let's see. Good to see our buddy Bill Russell, who was a part of our DawgNation cruise again. Bill Russell, former champion of our trivia contest, not able to defend his title in 2024, but back with us in 2025. Bill is a great guy. Happy to see him in the comments section here today. He says, by the way, checking in from the First Coast, the only way it could be better if there was football to see. Bill, I'm right there with you on that, but I am truly thrilled that you're here today. Baruch Dog, also noticing what I noticed. You got to understand something. I have no authority or power or even wherewithal with any of this stuff. I just sort of show up and do whatever it presents. DawgNation.com looks completely different today. It is amazing. It is amazing. Jeremy Smith checking in to say good morning. Jeremy, we're glad you're here. Let's pop over and see how the YouTube folks are doing today. No doubt they are in a spirited mood. I think the Georgia fans had a pretty strong reaction to some of the stuff we heard from Cantwell yesterday. We're going to play that for you here coming up in just a little bit. On YouTube, Texas Dog says, Georgia sharpens iron with iron. Miami sharpens iron. Yeah, so funny stuff from Texas Dog there. He says sharpens iron with lead, so there you go. Doghouse Lawn Care checking in. Kevin Flute checking in from Columbus, Georgia. Kevin, we're glad to have you down there. You keep all those Auburn fans at bay down there. Paul Moon says, weird situation with Cantwell. Everything was pointing to us. And, Paul, we're going to talk about that here in a moment of, well, how much any of that was ever real. And I'm going to tell you right now, as someone who's in the college football media, not a reporter, but in the media, I do think our folks that do what, similar stuff to what I do for a living, we're going to be careful about this. I do. You got to be careful with the pump and dump of, maybe in this case, that's really what went on, that it was Miami, then it was Georgia, and then it was back to being Miami again. Maybe it really was that. But, boy, I'm not really quite so sure how often you can ring that bell and have the audience respond without eventually sort of feel like they're being taken for a ride. I do think the industry is going to be careful with this. Jonathan Aaron wonders why I didn't give Cantwell some of that Jimbo money. Yeah. Even if I did have it, And if the reports are true that it was $2.5 million, I don't know that I'd be giving up my $2.5 million for a 16-year-old. And Cantwell may be going to be a great one. Certainly seems like he has a chance to be. But boy, that's a lot of money, man. That is a lot of money. Chandler Sorrell says, I don't see how it can be anything but money. I would agree with you on that. I mean, I do think that, look, Mario Cristobal is probably a good football coach. We don't have a ton of evidence on that. We've seen some pretty boneheaded late-game decisions from him. But he probably is a pretty good coach. He's certainly an offensive line-friendly head coach. Maribel, the offensive line coach, is a respected guy. So, I'm not going to, lie to anybody and say that somehow Miami has nothing to offer. We think they probably have something to offer. But when a program of a lesser stature than Georgia wins a battle like this, we're not going to apologize for assuming that the rumored financial compensation had to be a big factor in all that, especially given the fact it's been reported that Cantwell visited Georgia 6 times. So, this idea that somehow there was a much deeper connection with Miami that existed with Georgia, the travel docket does not necessarily suggest that being true. And as someone who was there yesterday, Jeff Sintel can tell you that Nixa, Missouri, and for some reason I always butcher his hometown. I've butchered that badly several times. Nixa, Missouri to Athens, Georgia is no easy travel plan. So you got to really want to go to do that. So just sort of keep that in mind. Tyrone Brown also checking in from Columbus, Georgia. We love to see Tyrone in here. Thomas T-Bone 86 says the NFL schedule comes out today, and how about them Braves? Yeah, I do think the NFL does a good job at schedule release. I think they do a good job of creating a thing sort of out of nothing, a meeting that could have been an email, and yet they do a good job of both, getting people to tune in for the show, but also the leaks throughout the day that just make the NFL a big hot topic of conversation. I have my issues with the NFL, but they, I think, do this very well. Daniel Denny coming in hard against the Braves. Daniel, what is that about? Spencer Clark says it's an offset of landing Curtis. Maybe so, but I don't believe that's initially what Georgia was thinking. I think that Georgia thought it had a chance to get both. I think it made a big push towards getting both. I just think I'm led to believe, both from on-the-record reporting and conversations that I'm having, I'm just sort of led to believe it got crazy late. Like crazy late. Ronald Wilson says Georgia still got several good prospects on the table, such as Tyler Atkinson, Mark Bowman. Totally agree with that. We still believe that Georgia's going to put an elite class together. I'm not going to sugarcoat it. I do think you want the elite offensive tackles. I do. I think things are a little crazy in that world right now, and so we're going to kind of talk about, okay, well, then what do you do then in light of just how crazy this market appears to be here at the moment? Daniel Denny says he's a Mets fan. That's why he's taking shots at the Braves. Well, Daniel, that makes sense. Well, listen, either way, we're glad you're here today. That's very funny. Very funny. He also has the, it looks like an Auburn avatar, so the orange and blue perhaps runs deep with Daniel there. Let's see what else. Randy Hall said, I heard the family has use of a several $million home in Miami. I did wonder that because I guess there's been some reporting of them all kind of, or suggestion they might all move down there. It's like, you want to find out how quickly $2.5 million can disappear? Move your whole family down to Miami. You find out when you start paying those real estate prices that perhaps $2.5 million doesn't go quite as far as it used to. Perhaps that's the case. All right, it's almost time to begin the show. What do you say we do this? I'll read one more comment. We'll get started. UGA Marine says, if it was what really happened with the money, I wouldn't be shocked if Kirby Smart and others avoid him in the future. Rumors will be abound, not worried and don't care. Kid made the decision. He says, bye, Felicia. Let's focus on who is here and actually committed to the G. Yeah, I mean, Georgia doesn't burn very many bridges. And the one thing about the Georgia coaching staff, and this is indifferent, in comparison to some fans, Georgia's coaching staff doesn't get their feelings hurt particularly easily. Say no to Georgia, it's easy to want to say, well, I never want anything to do with this guy again. Historically speaking, that's not how the Georgia coaches operate. But it's also fair to point out when it comes to the elite offensive tackles, you don't typically get those guys in the transfer portal anyway. So if history is our guide, Georgia's one chance of getting Cantwell was yesterday, and we'll never probably hear very much about that again one way or another. Let's fire up the animation. We'll get ready to tell you what is on today's show. Good morning, Dawg Nation. I am Brandon Adams. This is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans, presented by Breda Pest Management, and much has happened since we last spoke. So we're going to get into that here today of Jackson Cantwell choosing Miami over Georgia and all that transpired over the course of the 24 hours prior to that announcement that caused this to happen. And maybe most importantly, the question to ask is, where does Georgia go from here? We're going to try to figure that out. And we're going to hear from Cantwell in his own words, because I will tell you, some of the stuff that Jackson said yesterday drew a very strong reaction from Georgia fans. Not necessarily negative or anti-him, but just really inquisitive about what that means for the current state of college football that we find ourselves in right now. So we'll do that off the top of the program here today and figure out how Georgia kind of moves on after a recruiting battle that it thought it might win, going against the good guys yesterday afternoon. So it is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans, presented today by Breda Pest Management, and it begins right now.
Today's episode of DawgNation Daily is brought to you by Breda Pest Management, the official pest control of UGA athletics.
Presented by DawgNation.com. This is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans. Here's your host, Brandon Adams.
We're going to try to be really careful here today because I'm a little bit self-aware. Obviously, we are a pro-Georgia show, and yesterday, and really a lot of the last few days, we've spent several days talking about the possibility that five-star offensive tackle Jackson Cantwell would land at Georgia. In fact, yesterday, even with some of the early chatter that Cantwell is likely being pulled back towards Miami, I told you in the show that I'm not quite so sure I fully buy into all of that. Even yesterday during the show, based on some of what I was hearing, I still sort of thought that Georgia had a pretty good chance of winning this recruiting battle. Alas, it did not work out that way. And the thing I'm sort of self-aware about is I don't want this whole thing today to kind of come across as sour grapes. It should not have to be said, but I'll say it out loud anyway. I would have loved for Cantwell to have come to Georgia, and I would have loved for Georgia and Jackson Cantwell to come to some sort of financial agreement that would have allowed, Jackson to end up at UGA. This is a player we obviously wouldn't have not spent so much time talking about in the last few days if we did not think he would have potentially been a good fit for Georgia. It feels like that probably needs to be said. I don't want any of this to be construed as somehow sour grapes of, well, now that he didn't come to UGA, we're going to trash the player. We're not going to trash. I don't know that we've ever trashed any player around here. Don't plan on starting now. But all of that said, I do think we need to talk a little bit about some of the stuff that Jackson Cantwell had to say yesterday after he chose Miami over Georgia, because a lot of these words drew a pretty strong reaction from Georgia fans. And it wasn't, negative about Jackson. Boy, it raises a lot of questions about what really is going on with a lot of these recruitments and how much of this do we have a right to know. And listen, I'm going to give credit to my good friend and colleague, Jeff Santel. I thought Jeff, in the immediate aftermath of Cantwell choosing Miami over Georgia, which essentially had been predicted by all the major national guys by the time we kind of got to that moment, I thought Jeff, in a one-on-one interview with Jackson, asked some really important questions to him about, kind of how it all goes down. And look, we just live in a world now where you can't tiptoe around the name, image, and likeness money compensation. You can't pretend that doesn't exist. You can't really take it at face value that, I'm not worried about NIL. I just want to play football. You can't really take that at face value. You got to talk about the role that compensation does play in these decisions. When a player chooses Georgia, like Jared Curtis last week, when a player chooses elsewhere, like Cantwell did yesterday, you got to talk about the role that money plays in all of this. It's not easy information to get, but it is questions worth asking. Jeff asked Cantwell directly yesterday, about the money part of it and how much that really was the draw for him to Miami. And the lead into that was the fact that Pete Nakos from On3 had reported, and we'll show you this on the screen, that, just before that announcement yesterday, had logged the, quote, expert prediction for Miami to land Jackson Cantwell. And in the story for On3, Nakos, who had originally reported that Miami was willing to pay Cantwell as much as $2 million per year, was now upping that year one payment to $2.5 million per year, with the possibility it could go up each year after that. Now, I don't have to tell you, you already know this, that is a wild level of compensation. You know, that's like, second round NFL draft pick money for a guy who's only 16 years old, essentially a proven commodity post-college. You're paying a guy like that going into his college career. That is a wild compensation figure if that is indeed what Miami was offering. Jackson was, in a roundabout way, asked by Jeff that yesterday, and here is what he said about Pete Nakos' reporting. Take a listen to this.
Well, I think my response to it is it's not the same narrative people like Pete Nakos are pushing right now. I mean, I think there's just a false narrative that's why I'm choosing, and I think that, I think relationships won out with Miami. That was kind of what did it for me. I mean, they spent the most time with me. They put the most effort into recruiting me. I mean, I've got a lot of skin in the game with all these schools as far as like getting represented by Drew and making sure them to be fairly compensated. And I think every school has done a good job with that and being accommodating with that. And I think that anyone who'd say otherwise about how I've done my recruitment has been just misled.
So to Cantwell's credit, he has never shied away from the fact that he appreciates the fact that he's going to get paid well for playing football. And in a previous story with Jeff at DawgNation.com, did not shy away from the notion that they selected the super agent Drew Rosenhaus to represent him because of what they viewed as some really shrewd and ruthless negotiation tactics on the part of Rosenhaus. Rosenhaus is basically, I would say, the most famous NFL agent. It's rumored, I don't know if this has ever been confirmed, that the character Jerry Maguire was sort of based on Drew Rosenhaus. You've seen him on ESPN throughout the years. You know, I think even yesterday Jackson said they chose him, or reached out to him to be their agent because of what they had seen on HBO's Hard Knocks at one point in time. Like, Rosenhaus is sort of the stereotypical agent. I think even he would take that as a compliment. The kind of always on the phone, yelling at GMs, driving for more money. When you kind of close your eyes and picture what the NFL pro sport athlete agent looks like, I think that Drew Rosenhaus is one of the things that comes up there. And in previous stories at DawgNation.com, Cantwell has not really shied away from the fact that they kind of cold called, I guess, and reached out to Rosenhaus for that very reason. So he's not shy about saying that, strong, aggressive representation was something they were seeking out because obviously they wanted the highest compensation they could possibly get. But he also says the Pete Nakos report of I'm going to Miami because they're offering me $2.5 million, he calls that a false narrative. Okay, so what then is the nature of the contract that you're signing with Miami? And that's where things took an interesting twist with Jackson Cantwell yesterday. Here's another exchange between Cantwell and Jeff.
Jackson, for you, can you give any insight into what it looked like? Were they multi-year deals? Were there this much for this first year and then it escalated for the second year? What did the climate look like for you with what the schools were offering?
My contract is confidential.
Okay.
So listen, I don't care if you're 16 years old, which he is, or 65 years old. Here's what you don't get to do. You don't get to say your reporting about my contract is a false narrative. But then when you're provided the opportunity to kind of clarify some of those details, say, no, it's confidential. You can try that, but to the average person, you're just not going to really get away with that. Then one case, listen, I couldn't really pick Pete Nakos out of a lineup. I see him on X all the time, and he's obviously, a pretty prevalent figure in the ongoing college football conversation right now, but I legitimately don't know what he looks like. So he's not a friend of mine. I don't know him, but I do know in this particular case, Nakos is willing to put his name next to a specific number. The Cantwell camp says, well, that's not accurate, but it's also confidential. I think that people are by and large going to believe the guy putting his name to a specific piece of information more so than the guy who says, false narrative, but also trying to keep that confidential. And maybe Cantwell doesn't care. He has every right not to. But in terms of changing the story, that's not going to really work very much. And what's maybe more important than that, maybe more interesting than that is, do you notice this? And we did talk a little bit about this yesterday. And perhaps this is an indication of where some of this in college football might be going. Do you notice that, whether it be Jackson sort of speaking on behalf of Miami or the Miami fans that we've noticed talk about this, in some cases Miami media kind of doing a little bit like what I do, it seems like they view Jackson Cantwell coming to Miami for $2.5 million. Isn't it interesting that they seem to view that as a negative headline? I find that to be interesting because it doesn't necessarily have to be that way. We've said before that a lot of Georgia fans have a little bit of an insecurity right now, whether it be Miami or Texas or Oregon, these schools that we commonly hear about, that they have a financial wherewithal that Georgia might not have. And a lot of Georgia fans are kind of wondering, well, and this is a line of thought you sometimes hear, well, gosh, how are we going to keep getting these elite recruits into the program if somebody can sort of swoop in at the last moment, raise the stakes financially? Are we just sort of doomed now in, recruitments like Jackson Cantwell, Justice Terry, maybe Caleb Downs in Ohio State, on and on you might want to go with that? Is that just our destiny now? Some Georgia fans have a little bit of an insecurity about that. But as we pointed out yesterday, it seems like on the flip side of that, there's also the insecurity here too, where it certainly seems like Miami is pretty concerned about having it be thought that they only won a recruitment like this because of $2.5 million. That it seems to be somewhat conventional wisdom, no disrespect to Jackson Cantwell, but $2.5 million for a guy that hasn't even started his senior year yet is a laughable figure. That's just laughable. That you can't build a roster paying a guy like this $2.5 million and having some sort of semblance of parity with the rest of your roster. This is just not a sustainable way of putting a football program together, at least it would seem like. But if you're Miami, you could very easily say, well, listen, I'm sorry y'all are poor, but we're not poor. I guess if you had money like we did, if you had everything figured out like we did, you'd realize we're not worried about this. This is what we have ability to do. We're going to support our program financially. And if you can't figure it out, then, sucks to suck, I guess. But, there is a way they could perhaps say that if they wanted to. But do you notice that they're not? Do you notice the fact that they are also pretty sensitive about what if people think this guy only came because of money? Cantwell himself seems to be saying, what if people think I only chose Miami because of money? I find that to be interesting that they're just as sensitive about the narrative involving money as perhaps a program like Georgia might be on the losing end of this discussion. I just find that to be interesting. Do with that what you will. How about a couple of other things from Cantwell, though? Because here is ultimately, I think, the most important question as it relates to Georgia in all of this. And we've said this plenty. We've been candid about this a lot, that when it goes, if you want to go back in time to, like, say, early to mid-April, we were not talking about Jackson Cantwell on this show very much. Not because we don't like Jackson Cantwell, certainly not because we didn't think he was a great football player. He's obviously, the highest-rated prospect in his class. We typically talk about elite prospects here. We weren't talking a ton about Cantwell because, as I've told you, and maybe I was right, maybe I was wrong, but my perception was I didn't think Jackson Cantwell was coming to Georgia. I just didn't think he was. I didn't have much reason to believe this was going to happen. Maybe I wasn't giving Georgia enough of a chance, or maybe I was prophetic. I don't know. But my earnest belief was I didn't think Cantwell was coming to Georgia, and so therefore there wasn't a lot of reason for us to talk about that. But then lo and behold, we have the perception everything changed once, allegedly, Georgia convinced Cantwell to postpone his April 30th commitment date, take another visit to Georgia, and suddenly around that time, scheduling the visit, taking the visit, around that time, it became thought that all of a sudden Georgia was not only now a reinvigorated factor in Cantwell's recruitment, but it might actually be the favorite to now win this recruiting battle. So what exactly went down for Jackson on that visit he just took to Georgia? Jackson also talked about that yesterday.
Well, I had a great time with those guys. There's a lot of good people in Georgia. And again, tying back to what I said about it's hard to please everybody in this process because, Jared's a great dude. I love spending time with him. I think I spent time with Drew Bobo that weekend. Very quality dude. He seems like he's got a similar mindset to me, and he's very locked in on football. He just wants to get better. And and the staff made a great push, and I love spending time with them. I had a great time with those guys. I think they're great people. I think Stacey Searles has been absolutely one of my favorite people throughout this recruiting process. That was kind of when my recruitment blew up, is whenever the Dawgs offered me in July of 2023, and I can't thank those guys enough for how much time they put into me.
I mean, is that real? Was that ever real? I simply don't think we can know. I mean, here's the thing I think you got to be careful with. I'm talking about if you kind of live in this sort of media world that I live in. I think I have enough awareness to know that my attitude about some of this stuff is a lot different than many of yours is. You know, for instance, I've told you before, I have a fairly high tolerance for drama when it comes to recruiting. Even when, and I say this as a Georgia partisan, even when the player doesn't choose Georgia, it's still kind of fun. I mean, to me, yesterday was a lot more entertaining than just some random Tuesday in May would have otherwise been. I had kind of a good time with all of this, but I'm also very well aware, working in the media, I do benefit from some of that too. We've had large audiences the last few days. We'll have one again today. So I benefit from the potential hysteria around what Jackson Cantwell may or may not do. And so I've got to be careful assuming that my viewpoint on this is similar to those who don't draw a specific benefit from the extra chatter taking place around this. And like the one thing I don't ever want to be guilty of is almost what feels like for those of you who kind of live in this world. Y'all know what like a meme coin rug pull is, where you just like hype up. It's like almost like a pump and dump. You hype it up, and then you realize, oh no, you sort of end up, selling, cashing out, and it was never very real to begin with. I think we've got to be really, really careful that we don't turn recruiting coverage into something that feels like that, where it's, national voices saying Cantwell's going to Georgia after having previously not said that, only to eventually have it arrive where it sort of was the entire time. And to listen to Jackson Cantwell say it, in his mind, that was sort of always the case, even though the public chatter was far different than that. Let's hear one more from Jackson Cantwell.
Well, Steve Wiltfong did a great job of telling everybody where I was going to go throughout this process, and that's okay. I love Steve, but I think, I definitely was feeling Miami a lot after that spring practice I went to down there and those couple of those, and that was kind of where I was at there. And then going into around April, I was really wanting to look at Georgia, but it was kind of, at that point, it was kind of between Georgia and Miami still. And then after, I just kind of thought about it some more throughout that time, because I didn't know. And by the end, I just felt like everything I compared it to was Miami, and that was just the place I wanted to go.
So what is actually real with all of this? I don't know that we can ever know for sure. I mean, I've told you in the past, I sort of would believe anything, but actually do believe nothing. I mean, I'm getting very, very cynical about all of this. I think that many of you probably are too. But I think the questions that were asked yesterday were fair questions to be asked, and I give Cantwell credit for wanting to sit there and provide some answers, even if we are a little skeptical about some of the information we receive. Here's what we know. If Miami's willing to pay $2.5 million, then congratulations and good luck to you. Cantwell, good player, would have liked for Georgia to have had him. But at that price, it probably just can't quite work out as far as Georgia's concerned. So what matters then is where Georgia goes from here. And that is a question we're going to try to answer as the show rolls on. My name's Brandon Adams, and this is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans, presented today by Breda Pest Management. We're glad you're with us, no matter how you get to us, live on video, 10 a.m. across all platforms, including yesterday, by the way, live covering Jackson Cantwell from Nixon, Missouri, as Jackson chose Miami over UGA, confirming that Georgia was his number 2 choice in all of that. Many of you watched that on video. Happy to be on the radio. Their friends at Athens Sports Radio 960 The Ref today. Enjoyed being with them this morning, talking about a lot of this in the morning show, as I do each and every Wednesday. Podcast for our show, Apple, Spotify, everything else in between. Just thrilled to have you as a part of that, too. Just one way or another, we try to be on as many platforms as we can, giving you a chance to hear from us and find out, kind of what's going on with Georgia football. We're just glad you find a platform that works. And we're so happy to have our friends at Breda Pest Management who make all of this possible here as well. And I got to tell you, I love doing business on our show with folks like Breda Pest Management who are so deeply connected to Georgia fans. And listen, if you watch or listen to our show, you'll see our buddy Matt Breda in our comment section frequently. He's interacting and going back and forth with UGA fans. He's sort of living and dying with everything that happens with all kinds of Georgia sports. Big Braves fan too, but big Georgia fan. And he's been serving the audience that we have for years, and that same level of service, he wants to provide it for you here too. And the good news is, we talk a lot about NIL and compensation. Listen, most of us don't have a $2.5 million offer out there for our services. I wish I did, but I probably don't here right now. So therefore, I have to be very judicious about how I choose to spend my money, and perhaps you're the same way on that, which is another big reason why you're going to want to work with Breda Pest Management, because of their track record of success in business since 1975, 125 employees. It's like a multi-generational company that has been taking good care of people for a very long time. Because they've had so much success, they can leverage that for our benefit by putting more money back in our pocket when we make the switch to Breda Pest Management. That is what they're all about. So I want you to find them online. It's BredaPest.com, BREDA, BredaPest.com. In Georgia, you got to have termite protection. You already know that. Termites are just a fact of life here in our state. You probably want bugs and critters, off your property there too. Well, when you choose Breda Pest Management to service you for all of that, they're going to put more money back in your pocket just for making that switch. So kick that fly-by-night company you've been working with to the curb and trust our friends at Breda Pest Management. It's online, BredaPest.com, BREDA, BredaPest.com for more on that today. All right, we're going to keep this conversation going with Mike Griffith here in a minute. But prior to that, I want to go around the doghouse today, presented by our friends at Georgia Farm Bureau. And as I said before, I want to talk more about kind of where Georgia goes from here on all of this. First of all, I'll invite you to check out a story that Jeff Sintel has up at DawgNation.com, where he kind of looks at some of the other elite offensive tackle prospects in the country who maybe he's not currently listing Georgia as a finalist, maybe a couple of folks who might be in the mix for Georgia. That's important. But let me tell you, and you can tell me if you agree with this or not, my, I guess, main opinion on all this is, while I would have loved to have gotten Cantwell, and I have to keep repeating that over and over again, I would have loved for Georgia to have gotten, Jackson Cantwell. It's really important to have elite offensive tackle play, and the easiest way to get an elite offensive tackle is to bring in an elite offensive tackle prospect. That is just a straight line from point A to point B in terms of producing success. Would have loved to have gotten Cantwell. I still don't think that whatever's going to happen for Georgia in 2026 and beyond is the most important question involving Georgia's offensive line. So if we ask, where does Georgia go next after Cantwell makes the decision to choose Miami? Step one is not who you bring in class of 2026 or anything like that. Step one is taking the current talent you have in the program and getting the most out of that talent. That if suddenly Monroe Freeling comes back from injury, and if he has a great year, and if Ernest Green shakes off the injuries that he dealt with a year ago, if he has a great year, at that point in time, there will be very little concern about Jackson Cantwell or anything else that might happen in the future, because we will be enjoying that present tense success. And listen, I really do believe this, that when you look at what Miami is alleged to have spent on Cantwell, I don't quite know what you do about that. We're going to talk later on the show about the fact that, according to some Ross Dellinger reporting, that Deloitte, apparently, if it is actually deputized to be the audit firm scrutinizing a lot of these future NIL deals, apparently they're going to draw a pretty hard line about what is and isn't fair compensation, which means we could see, in theory anyway, compensation going down for athletes in the future. My question would be, do you really believe, if we've got more Drew Rosenhauses coming to college football, do any of us really believe that they're ever going to agree to kind of a lid and a cap on how much money these athletes can make, even if that's what the shape of the House versus NCAA settlement looks like right now? Do we really believe that the agents that represent these players are going to agree to that in the future? I have a hard time imagining that. I really do. I don't know there's some sort of rule or policy or even a law coming in the future that kind of puts the toothpaste back in the tube when it comes to athlete compensation. I really don't. As I've told you, if we think that $2.5 million for a 16-year-old is an outlandish figure, if we think that's true, and I think many of us do, I think our only hope is for the natural market correction to occur when, I mean, like right now, people saw Ohio State, at least theoretically, spend millions of dollars, what was it, 25, 30, whatever the rumor was, to, in the minds of a lot of people, buy a national championship last year. Whether that was true or not, they obviously had plenty of homegrown talent on that team too. Whether that was true or not, that's the perception that's out there. So all of a sudden now, all kinds of money bags boosters for all kinds of programs think, well, if Ohio State can do that, I want to do that for my favorite school too. I want to do that for my alma mater as well. So the infusion of like sort of crazy cartoonish money in college football, especially prior to the House settlement structure kind of coming to full agreement, it may get worse for a minute before it gets better. There's at least a possibility that's true with the class of 2026. But eventually, we could see some stabilization occur when a lot of these guys who spend big dollars come to the realization that, just like we see in pro sports all the time, the most aggressive spenders in free agency don't always get the return on investment they were hoping for. That if it was just as easy as buying success, anybody with a few dollars could do that. But we see that sports, when it comes to actual winning and losing, is just a lot more complicated than that. And there could be, I think, maybe some natural correction coming eventually to some of this outlandish NIL money, if it really is, far out in front of what a more, normal compensation might look like. And so if you're Georgia, then all you've got to do is sort of bide your time until that some sense of normalcy, some sense of stabilization takes place. You just got to sort of bide your time until that happens, which once again puts the spotlight on, do you have enough elite talent in your program right now to maintain the standard that you've enjoyed until whatever craziness happens around you at least has some chance to stabilize, however that might take place, which, as I said before, puts a really big spotlight on Freeling and Green right now at offensive tackle, what you might have after that waiting in the wings for the future, whether it's John Jackson or Juan Gaston or whatever else. Do you have enough in your program right now that you can be okay until whatever craziness is currently happening figures out which direction it's moving in? And I think the answer to that question might be, yeah. For now, Georgia may have enough elite talent still in the program to actually be okay in the offensive line, and whatever issue it has with future offensive lines, they may be able to punt to the future on. In fact, with that in mind, around the Doghouse presented by Georgia Farm Bureau, let me play a clip for you we played the other day, kind of a shortened, truncated version of what Cole Cubelic had been saying on his podcast, that despite the fact that Georgia really struggled with the offensive line a year ago, at least in terms of rushing yards and things like that, that Cubelic, who is an objective observer here, not a Georgia guy, thinks perhaps against the grain of consensus opinion that Georgia can have the best offensive line in the SEC this year. Me choosing to highlight one name in particular that Cubelic talked about. This is sort of a spliced together version of what Cole talked for a few minutes about on his podcast. Here he is touting Georgia as possibly the best offensive line in the SEC in 2025.
I think last year's a bit of an anomaly for Georgia. Right this second, I'm going to go Georgia as a number one group. I think injuries got in the way. Georgia, I think, will be in a better spot of knowing who their first five are, and there are a couple that could work their way into that might not be there yet. And here's my ultimate Hail Mary for this Georgia offense and for this Georgia offensive line. I'm going to give Ernest Green a little bit of a pass. Because, number one, I just don't think in general we do that much anymore. And I don't think we can look at guys and just say they had a down year, they had an off year, or something happened and it just wasn't good. But they can get it corrected. I've seen great football in this kid. It's out there. The film of Ernest Green being dominant is there. Consistently, can it come back? Maybe. If it does, I think Georgia's got a chance to have the best offensive line in the SEC. I think last year's a bit of an anomaly for Georgia.
So that's Cubelic, who I respect, especially when it comes to the offensive line, touting the Georgia offensive line, and in the clip we played, touting Ernest Green in particular. And he talked a lot about a lot of the offensive linemen, but I wanted to highlight the Ernest Green statement in particular because he says he has seen elite from him on film before. And it's a simple point, but it's one I'll restate. If Ernest Green is as good as Cole Cubelic thinks he can be, and he also had some complimentary things to say about Monroe Freeling too, at that point in time, I don't think any of us are thinking all that much about Jackson Cantwell. And I do think it puts the ball in the court of Miami. Congratulations. I guess you paid $2.5 million to get this very young man here right now. But based on how this plays out over the course of the next couple of years, I do think it'll be interesting to see is when it's time to do all this all over again, if Miami wants to spend that same amount of money again. I think that's at least worth paying attention to. And that is Around the Doghouse. It's presented today by our friends at Georgia Farm Bureau. By the way, we love the homegrown talent that Georgia's always bringing in. A little bit easier recruiting battle sometimes when it involves guys like that. And speaking of things being homegrown, our friends at Georgia Farm Bureau always appreciate that too. The agricultural community in our state, the farmers that put food on the table for Georgians and really folks all over the world. Georgia Farm Bureau has supported them for a long time. That same level of support, they want to provide that to you too when it comes to your insurance needs. You got to have auto insurance, home insurance. Many of you trust Georgia Farm Bureau for your financial services needs as well. And they want to provide that for you. We say it all the time. Georgia Farm Bureau is always the home team. Friendly folks who live in Georgia, who are doing life in Georgia on a daily basis just like you. So trust them for all your insurance needs, auto, home, everything else. Give them a call, 877-404-1050. 877-404-1050. Find them online, gfbinsurance.com. That is gfbinsurance.com. Glad to have Georgia Farm Bureau as a part of Around the Doghouse here today. All right, so that's sort of the story. Georgia picking up the pieces here after not getting Jackson Cantwell yesterday, perhaps with renewed hope for its offensive line here in 2025. Let's find out now what our guest thinks about that. Let's bring on Mike Griffith here today, DawgNation Daily, presented by Breda Pest Management.
From Athens and across the SEC or wherever the recruiting trail may lead, here's a DawgNation.com insider.
We bring in Mike Griffith here. Mike, let's start with the Cantwell stuff, and we'll work to the stuff with Cole, because I know you wrote a story about that at DawgNation.com as well. In pro sports all the time, when it comes to a player acquisition, especially as a free agent, it's always, do you like the player at the price that it costs? Because there's no such thing as unlimited financial resource, whether it's a hard salary cap or just a budget. Financial resource is always, to a degree, finite. And I would say the same thing's true for Georgia here, too. I don't know that the national report of $2.5 million for Jackson Cantwell is accurate. I have a pretty dim view about a lot of the NIL reporting that does exist. But this is a guy putting his name next to a specific number. We have kind of no choice but to believe it must be somewhat true, because of the fact that the reporter was willing to go on the record and basically offered that up as the figure. So I got to tell you, I think I like Jackson Cantwell as a player. I'm assuming ranked as the number one prospect for a reason, but I don't think you can pay $2.5 million for an unproven commodity like that. I just don't think you can. Now, you say, well, how are you going to get elite offensive tackles? Because they're all expensive right now. David Sanders was expensive a year ago. Cantwell is expensive this year. That's a fair question. I think you're probably going to try to bide your time here for a couple of years and try to figure out where all this is going. But I do think the price that has been reported does impact the way you feel about the player when it comes to Cantwell. Do you agree?
Yeah, certainly to a certain extent. I think you said it yesterday when you were doing your breakdown. I was watching the programming live, and man, it was a great program. For those people that missed it, it's worth going back and watching and seeing Jeff Sentel's report, and BA and Connor broke it down really well. I think what we need to realize right now, though, is we're kind of in the last moments of the Wild West, BA. So right now, there's not a salary cap. That $2.5 million, obviously you look at it and go, oh my gosh, if you're only going to spend $18 million on football, how in the world does that work? Well, it really doesn't. Even if it's an outside deal, it doesn't really apply because we don't have that that House versus NCAA settlement is just such a stick in the mud. And I just put a story up on that. Once that gets decided, once Claudia Wilkin approves, and hopefully that's going to happen, and the attorneys have given her a plan to grandfather in the roster limitations. Hopefully she makes that approval, then we'll move forward. And then that $20.5 million cap comes into play. And you're not going to see these kind of deals anymore. Right now, everybody's front loading. Everybody's going, oh my gosh, make a mad scramble. This money, you can pay this money now and it's not going to count. You can have booster involvement. It's not going to count against your cap, right? Because as you alluded to earlier in the program, Deloitte put out a report and said, hey, guess what? 70% of these booster deals, we wouldn't approve them as fair market. They also said, though, that the outside businesses, 90% of them would have been approved. So where this is going is here. The booster money is going to be a part of that 20.5 million cap. The kind of deals that are being made right now to pay a guy like a Cantwell, I'm assuming that's coming out of a Miami booster. Yeah, that's not going to happen anymore. So that's why there's a mad scramble right now, because we don't have the House versus NCAA settlement finalized, approved. Once that gets approved, these sort of booster deals, theoretically at least, are going to be out the window, and kids are going to have to start making what we call fair market deals. And I don't think Jackson Cantwell, to your point, would demand $2.5 million in a fair market deal. So we're kind of in the last stages of the before, and then once we get to the NCAA House settlement, we're going to have an after, where I don't think you're going to see these sort of deals, certainly not for offensive linemen.
Okay, I want to talk about this, but I want to try to be careful it doesn't get too tedious, because I think this is important, but I don't want to get too lost in the weeds on it. I totally agree with you that we're seeing very aggressive tactics, I would say the last couple of recruiting cycles, kind of ahead of whatever they think is going to happen with this House versus NCAA settlement. That, I think, is just objectively true. You can obviously see how a lot of that is taking shape. And as I've said on the show, Mike, a couple of times, I'm actually more optimistic than I've been in probably the last 2 or 3 years that there might be a future for college athletics that sort of looks a lot like what I've kind of come to expect as college athletics. I'm actually fairly optimistic about a pathway in the future that a lot of what we love about college athletics can be protected. However, and this is where I think I want to get a little bit deeper into what you just said. I'm not a lawyer. I can't tell you exactly how this is going to play out, but I simply do not believe, and this is not necessarily what I want to be true, I'm just talking about what I think is going to happen. I don't see any way that the representatives of the players are going to agree to something that essentially caps their earning potential, whether it be the state of Oregon that's trying to fight this legally, or just old school under the table payments, just to be honest with you, or what. I don't see any way that whatever the Jackson Cantwell of the future is going to have somebody shrug and say, hey, we tried to pay you $2 million, but Deloitte said we can't, so therefore we're not going to. I don't know legally how we get to it and how we wrestle with that, but it certainly seems like, I don't care what, like you said, Claudia Wilkin, the judge who's, I guess, mediating this finality of the House versus NCAA settlement, whatever happens with that, I just get the sense we got way more court stuff coming up here, because any athlete who has any attempt to have their compensation capped because of what a audit firm says, I just think that's an immediate trip to court in every single one of those instances. As someone who's actually growing more optimistic about the future of college athletics because of some of the stuff we've heard as of late, I don't think we're ever going to get any sort of legal remedy for how do you prevent school A from paying an exorbitant fee for player B. I don't think there's any legal remedy coming from that. I think the only hope we have is that market forces eventually disincentivize that.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. I mean, it's human nature, right? Anytime there's competition, people are going to be motivated to work in the gray areas and even cross those lines. And some of the quote greatest coaches of all time were also some of the most notorious rule breakers in their recruitments in recent history. And you can read into that what you want. Maybe not that recent a history, but maybe, closer to 2008, 9, 10, somewhere around there. But to your point, yes, it's going to be hard to legislate, Uncle Joe not getting a little bit of extra money from school X to maybe filter into the family, or the church of so-and-so getting a miraculous donation. That those types of things have always been hard to legislate, and hard to follow and hard to prove. But as far as what we can control, or what they are trying to control with a revenue sharing model, which is where you get that 20.5 million, that's roughly 22% of what these athletic departments are making. those are the guardrails, right? You can't blame the NCAA. If they give you the guardrails and they give you a working program, it's going to be hard to, as you said, patrol that, police that. In the past, the only reason some of these cheating cases were found out was that money was transferred across state lines, which made it a federal crime and enabled the FBI to tap into bank accounts and personal finances. The NCAA doesn't have that power. It needs to become a federal crime. And that's how these programs were found out before. Now that's still possible, because that's, what is that, racketeering, I guess, when money changes hands and there's no taxes paid, whatnot. But this is why, circling it all back and trying to tie it all together and saying, well, then what? What do we do? This is why you need congressional oversight, because you need to have rules in place that are enforceable, perhaps even a union, perhaps a commissioner, similar to the NFL. Let's just make this mirror the NFL. The story I just posted, Brandon, 16-team playoff coming down the pipe, OTAs coming down the pipe, single portal window, i.e. free agency period, coming down the pipe. College football is turning into the NFL before our eyes, and it will need to be managed like the NFL in order to be effective and have some semblance of order.
Yeah, I mean, let me put a pin in that, because that's like the one thing I don't want, right? I want college football to feel like college football. And I think, like I said, we don't have time to get into this right now, but I think the more you try to make college football like the NFL, sort of NFL light or NFL minor leagues, I mean, listen, look around the sporting landscape. Minor leagues are not popular. College football is popular because it exists as an entity kind of unlike anything in the world of, I'm talking about the Earth, planet Earth. It's unlike anything else. It's a uniquely American thing, and it's college athletics. Try to make it more like another thing, ultimately, I think, makes college football, college athletics less popular than it currently is, but we don't have time to get into that too much more today. I want to bring it back to Georgia here for a moment, because, and as I tried to say to our audience to kick off the show today, this is not sour grapes for me. I wanted Georgia to get Jackson Cantwell. I'd have every reason to believe that Cantwell was an elite prospect, thought Georgia was in a pretty good position coming off the weekend. I'm not trying to flippantly disregard the fact that I would love to have had Jackson Cantwell on his way to UGA. But when you don't get him, you turn the page and say, okay, what next? And for me, and I know this is a story you've written at DawgNation.com, if Monroe Freeling comes back from injury, if Ernest Green comes back from injury, and if they have great seasons, if they're mauling people in road grading for Georgia this fall, I'm not going to be thinking much about Jackson Cantwell at that point in time. I'm going to be happy about the offensive line that Georgia has. And I'm also going to be hopeful that the next generation of guys kind of behind them, whether it's Gaston or Jackson or whatever else, they might be able to do the same thing. That I do believe, a topic we addressed earlier this week, and you've written about today at DawgNation.com, in light of the Cantwell news, this becomes more important, that a guy like Cubelic, and I know this is just content for his podcast, so, whatever, but at the same time, I do think he knows offensive line play. I think he's a respected analyst. The fact that perhaps a little bit against the prevailing consensus believes that Georgia can be the best offensive line in the SEC. Well, if that be the case, then, honestly, I don't know that we're worried too much about 2026 recruiting battles at that particular point. What did you make of what Cole had to say? I know you wrote about it.
Yeah, well, I mean, he's the chairman of the Joe Moore Award, so he watches these lines closely, and he has seen these guys at their best, and I think he's got confidence in Stacey Searles as well. And last year, let's face it, last year was an anomaly. It was a perfect storm, right? I mean, you had tailbacks injured. You had every offensive lineman missed at least a week of practice with an injury. You had the schedule from hell. Your defense was not good. You were playing from behind often, which made you one-dimensional, so you couldn't have the balance, even if you had the healthy tailbacks, even if you had the continuity. It was a perfect storm. So I don't think it's a great leap to say the offensive line is going to perform better, even though, you'd look at the surface and go, hey, 4 guys are leaving, they got to be worse. Well, not necessarily, because those 4 guys didn't play together every week. And, there's Tate Ratledge, and how many weeks was he out? So I don't think that's a big stretch. And when you look at Freeling and Green and the upside and the talent that both of these guys have, I think Cole's right on. And I'll say this for Jackson Cantwell, just kind of reading between the lines, and I don't know if it's 30 years of press conferences, but you kind of get an ear for this. He mentioned, as long as there, he did drop something in there, as long as there wasn't a coaching change. And he did mention wanting to play early. He did mention the Miami campus, which It is a beautiful campus, but guess what? You're not going to see much of it if you're on the practice field or in the weight room. This is not a guy that's going to stay at Miami for 4 years, based on what I heard yesterday. And this is not a guy that would have been the right fit for Georgia right now. If those are the things that are a priority to him, the campus and the money, the fact that he took a visit to Georgia when he already had a pretty good idea he was going to Miami, tells me he probably got paid to make the visit. That money now, me now mentality does not work at Georgia. And we've seen that. And yes, he's an incredibly talented guy. And yes, I'm sure Kirby would have felt like this is a guy that could have worked and fit into the culture. But I don't see it happening. So to me, I always think there's a silver lining in the sense of Georgia's the kind of place with what they have to offer, with the coaching, the community, the fellowship among the players, the opportunity to compete for a championship every year. Hey, if that's not enough of a sell for you, then you're probably not the right guy. Because to me, you can't get that anywhere else. You're not going to get, the Georgia, pedigree, the Georgia NFL, how many guys they're putting in the NFL, the chance to compete for a championship, the chance to go up the best in practice every day, the coaching stability. To me, if those things aren't of great value to you, then it's going to be hard for you to invest what it takes to be a Georgia Bulldog. Because we've said it, BA, and I must have said it out loud to myself 5 times when I was writing in your comments, Georgia ain't for everyone. And listening to that kid talk yesterday, it ain't for him right now, not at this stage of his life. This kid from Missouri, I don't know how much he knows about the SEC. Let's face it, Missouri's kind of a left-handed SEC team. When you go to their stadium, you're like, where am I? They don't have the same culture. They don't have the same, and I'm not saying that they're not competitive because they have been competitive, but you go to Missouri and you don't feel like you're in the SEC. It just doesn't feel the same as a warm Saturday afternoon or a crazy night under the lights where anybody can be. It's Missouri. And I don't think he's drinking the Kool-Aid that you got to be able to drink to make it under Kirby Smart. I mean, you got to go through some serious work here, serious competition. You better want to be here and have your priorities in order, because if you're looking for, fast times and great campuses and Coral Gate, that ain't this. And I don't know how much time he thinks he's going to have for all that. I'll tell you this. When I went down and talked to Lawrence Cager a few years ago, I guess it was 5 years ago when he transferred to Georgia, DawgNation flew me down there and I met with Cager and I went to his apartment in Coral Gables. And I saw it. I said, okay, I can see where this would, I saw the pool and all. Listen, Cager was done. He didn't, he went on that Miami campus, and I remember we were getting ready to get a photo shoot in front of the U there that I was going to send back for, and people didn't, and he told me, he said, man, I never felt like I was even a part of this. Like, people were mad that he was trying to get his pick. It was like, he couldn't wait to get to Georgia and be a part of Kirby Smart's program. You think about Lawrence Cager. So when I think about Miami and Georgia and seeing those two cultures, all right, now Georgia ain't for everyone. And Miami ain't for everyone either. I mean, I can't imagine. Can you imagine Tate Ratledge at Miami? I can't. Ain't no way Tate Ratledge would. Because why? Because Tate was an SEC guy. He wanted to be here. He wanted to be a part of this, right? So that's kind of my silver lining for you on the Cantwell thing, is after listening to him talk, I said, yeah, no, doesn't appreciate the value of this place yet. Not to say you won't get him in the portal. Not to say that he might not change his mind before the ink is dry on the final contact. Doubtful, but still possible. But to me right now, that's a young guy who just wanted to get it over with. The money was on the table, who's maybe doesn't see the big picture all the way yet and may never see the big picture. Like we said, and I'll close with this, Georgia ain't for everyone, and it wasn't for Cantwell.
All right, Mike, appreciate your time. Thanks for being here on the program today. We'll look forward to talking to you soon.
All right, appreciate it, man. Thanks, BA. Have a good one.
You too.
Let's take a look around the rest of the league. This is SEC Proof.
Yeah, listen, I'm not going to pretend like, obviously, a lot of the stuff about, Jackson Cantwell would not be a good fit for Georgia. We're not saying that before yesterday. So let's just, make sure we, stay fair about all of that. But the point that I wanted to get to, though, is that, I ultimately have the belief that if this Georgia offensive line in 2025 plays the way that we think it's, capable of, or at least one respected analyst thinks it's capable of, then maybe the sting of losing an elite prospect in 2026, you won't feel that quite as much. And that's, by the way, true no matter who else Georgia kind of goes out there and gets. And obviously, there'll be attention paid to, well, now maybe you got more money for Tyler Atkinson. Maybe you've got more money for Mark Bowman. These are some of the names you might hear. And that's all well and good. You still have to be elite at offensive tackle. And the easiest way to be elite at offensive tackle is to bring in elite offensive tackle recruits. Right now, that has become a very pricey proposition. Cantwell this year with David Sanders a year ago. That is a pricey proposition. I don't know what that means for you for the future. I really don't. You got to try to figure that out. But are you okay for the present? If you are, that gives you some time to sort of try to figure out where this sport is going. By the way, more on that in a moment. Prior to that, let's go cruise around the SEC, courtesy of Royal Caribbean today. And let's get you ready. Speaking of the future, the near future for Royal Caribbean, it's so exciting right now. I love the Icon class of ships. And obviously, you know, you've heard it said before when Icon first set sail, it's the largest cruise ship in the world, and that's kind of a cool thing. But the truth is maybe this is more specific for me because I do enjoy Royal Caribbean Cruise Vacations. You know, one of my favorite things about Icon and the Icon class of ships is the way that it introduces kind of new ideas into the cruise space and those specialty restaurants that they're famous for, like the Playmaker Sports Bar and Grill, but also the Dueling Pianos Bar where you can kind of hang out and enjoy some great entertainment there. Just so many fun new things on each of the Icon class of ships. And when Star of the Seas, which is the newest Icon class of ship, when it debuts this August, man, you're going to love that, sailing out of Port Canaveral. This is going to be such an exciting experience. It's going to be the talk of the kind of travel and vacation world when Star of the Seas debuts. And right now, you have your chance to be among the first to sail on it. I'll tell you this, and you already know this about me. I am so hopeful that I get my own opportunity to be a part of this. Come back and tell you all about it. It starts in August. A great time to sort of think about this upcoming fall, early 2026. Really fun times to be on board Star of the Seas. And Jessica Slater, a wonderful travel advisor, especially selected for us by Royal Caribbean for all of our Royal Caribbean cruise vacation needs. She can tell you all about it. Give her a call, 770-718-9147. That's 770-718-9147. You can also email her at jslater@dreamvacations.com. The brand new Star of the Seas, you can be on that and be a part of it. I think you're going to really, really like it. All right. As we go cruise around the SEC, courtesy of Royal Caribbean, I want to reference something that I mentioned earlier and Mike made mention of too a moment ago. That is some reporting by Ross Dellinger yesterday. We're around that time of year where the conference spring meetings take place. The SEC, roughly, it's usually right around Memorial Day. They kind of gather in Destin, Florida, typically, to talk about various things related to the conference this year. No doubt there'll be plenty of chatter about the move to a 9-game conference schedule. After several years of giving this a shot, it seems like now they may actually be ready with some additional compensation from ESPN, ready to move in that direction. But this week, the ACC spring meetings are also taking place. They do theirs in Amelia Island, Florida. It's always like really nice coastal locations for these little get-togethers. You always notice that. But the point is, at the ACC spring meetings, they had a representative from the accounting and consulting firm Deloitte on hand yesterday. Deloitte is the company that will be deputized to scrutinize NIL contracts in the future. And apparently, if they have their way, they're going to be pretty specific about what they do and don't allow. Dellinger, who's good at all this, reporting yesterday that in a meeting with Deloitte officials at ACC spring meetings, the company shared that with ADs and coaches, some interesting figures on the NIL clearinghouse. According to Deloitte, looking back at previous NIL deals, 70% of past deals from booster collectives would have been denied, while 90% of deals from public companies would have been approved. So in other words, if you see, like, say, Brock Bowers doing some sort of radio or TV commercial, typically speaking, Deloitte says, hey, the compensation for that's kind of within the boundaries of what is sort of fair market. But when it's unnamed booster quietly giving some sort of unreported figure to the player, oftentimes that ended up sort of being the kind of pay-for-play thing, which NIL, at least theoretically, was not supposed to be. How are we ever going to get agreement on this? We can't get agreement on anything. I don't have any confidence that we'll ever have these people from Deloitte sitting up in a ivory tower somewhere saying, no, this compensation is not allowed, and having the players and their representatives and the lawyers they have on standby. I just have a hard time believing we'll ever get to actual agreement on that. That doesn't mean that I think the compensation is always going to be the runaway train that it sort of feels like it is right now. I think the fair market and the actual market forces could eventually impact that. I explained that earlier in the show and have explained that in the past. But this ain't it. It's good reporting from Ross Dellinger. It's probably an accurate read on the situation from Deloitte. But I don't think the power that Deloitte seeks, that this settlement with the NCAA is supposedly supposed to grant them, I don't have any confidence this ever takes place. I really don't. I don't think this ever happens. And whether it be through presidential commissions or congressional intervention or whatever else, I'm actually fairly optimistic that college sports can have a future, more so than I've been in the past. I think the public tide is moving that direction, and politicians, whichever party you represent, always notice the direction the wind is blowing when it comes to public opinion. Public opinion is against the Wild West, the way it's been understood, but you're not going to get legal remedy when it comes to compensation. I just don't think there's any chance you get that. But it is interesting reporting from Ross Dellinger. Speaking of interesting reporting, let's give you some additional interesting reporting here. And this is relevant for the SEC. So do you know who Pete Thamel is? Thamel, kind of the insider reporter guy for ESPN. He goes on, speaking of Cole Cubelic, Cole's radio show, McElroy and Cubelic on WJOX in Birmingham, big college football presence they have. And Thamel on that show this week saying that he sees a pretty bleak future for conference championship games. I want to read you the quote here. I try not to read too much, but I do want to read you this quote to set up the conversation. Thamel telling Greg and Cole, I think one conversation going on right now is a philosophical one on conference championship games. We saw a decrease in relevancy for conference championship games last year, just simply put. And this is a lot like a microcosm of college athletics in and of itself. He goes on to say, the inevitable phasing out of relevancy of conference championship games, we have empirical evidence of it, and it's staring us right in the face. Do these leagues, which, by the way, it's very valuable inventory. It's very, very valuable for the league. It's a moneymaker, huge moneymaker, premium ticket, big event. Do they pivot and say, with the college ball playoff automatic qualifiers, which seemingly are on the way, do we play 4 playing games and go 1 through 8, 2 through 7, et cetera, and still have the, in case the top dog gets upset, some sort of, basically opportunity for them to still make when it comes to the conference championship game and sneak in. He says that would be giving up a premium property to your television partner that would clearly want it. It would also be giving up a big gate moneymaker. He says, you've been to the SEC championship games. That's an event, man. Whoever's there owns Atlanta that weekend. And see, this is kind of the problem. And this is where I do think, and we gave Greg Sankey and the SEC some credit earlier this week for an effective negotiation, getting more money from ESPN for the 9th conference game. That's an example of a win from the SEC. We try to call balls and strikes around here. When we see the SEC do something good, we want to give them credit for it. But I don't care what family or anybody else says. Throughout history, there's really only been one conference championship game that really matters, and it's the SEC. I've said this before. The SEC championship game has been my favorite sporting event, more so than anything else. I love the SEC championship game. I love the big game feel that it provides. I am very thankful that Georgia won that game this past season. I treated that as a very big win. Most of you did too. But it is different now. And, Kirby kind of referenced this in his post-game comments. The stadium was a little slower to fill up. It didn't quite have that buzz. I sometimes think of it as a big fight feel, like you're in the arena for a big boxing match or a UFC event. The buzz that exists, kind of the big fight feel. You didn't quite have big fight feel, big game feel prior to the SEC championship. Now, it got there as the game went on, but, Thamel says he sees a decrease in relevancy. I don't think the outcome meant any less for Georgia, but the vibe around the game has been reduced. And I'm sorry, I can't see this as anything other than an unforced error on the part of the SEC, because the SEC seemingly has been coerced or convinced to trade something that matters to acquire something that in the eyes of the public matters far less. Historically speaking, the SEC championship game has been more popular than the first round of the college football playoff was this year. Now, the ACC title game, nobody cares about it. It takes place in Charlotte. There's like 5,000 people in the stands. It could disappear tomorrow, and nobody would notice. The Big 12 title game is kind of a fun game to watch. It's usually the lead-in for the SEC championship game. It has no cultural relevance. The Big 10 title game gets decent TV ratings because it's a lot of big markets that kind of follow the league. But the games are never close. There's no real care. I mean, no one's like, man, let's go to Indianapolis for the Big 10 title game, the same way that Atlanta becomes a pilgrimage for the SEC fans who are lucky enough to be there. The SEC created the idea of the conference championship game. Every league eventually copied it, but it was always a poor imitation of what the SEC had. The SEC had something special, and now at the expense of an expanded playoff that frankly is just not nearly as popular with the average fan as it is with the television executives, the SEC has somehow been convinced to give up something that was special and meaningful, something that mattered both from a business and kind of a cultural standpoint, to trade it for an expanded playoff that I think in the eyes of a lot of folks is sort of just kind of an unnecessary bloat. That's kind of what this trade looks like right now. I believe if this is really the way we're going, and it seems like we are, more and more playoffs, and maybe a world in which this jewel of a sporting event like the SEC championship game no longer exists, and the SEC, I think, has been played for fools. And we'll make that cruising around the SEC courtesy of Royal Caribbean. And before we get ready to wrap up here today, let me also get ready to shout out our friends at the Finish Long Drink. Obviously, it's a great time of year to be outside. My pool in my neighborhood is open, playing some golf these days. And when I'm thinking about being outside and enjoying great stuff, I love the Finish Long Drink, whether it be the peach-flavored version, which a lot of folks here in the Peach State seem to be loving. There's the pineapple that's out there. I know people love that. The Long Drink Zero, the traditional citrus, that's the blue can, the grapefruit flavor, the gin kick. The truth is that's still my favorite. My wife likes the Long Drink Cranberry. A lot of y'all like the Long Drink Strong, 8.5% alcohol by volume. Whichever variety you like, it's out there for you, and it's time to pick up some more. Or for maybe some of you, it's time to try it for the very first time. So if you go to the website, thelongdrink.com, you can put in your website, and you can find out where you can pick some up today. Make it a big part of your spring, your summer, as you get fun family get-togethers for these upcoming holidays, graduation parties, celebration, things like that, 21 and up, of course. You can enjoy everything with the Finish Long Drink. So find more online, thelongdrink.com, for that today. And as we get ready to say goodbye, first of all, great shout-out to the Atlanta Braves. Our long nightmare is over after an 0-7 start to begin the year. Atlanta has now, last night, finally worked its way back to 500, perhaps getting new life on the season the rest of the way, getting a win over Washington last night. And we kind of wanted to do something to celebrate the Braves on the show today. So for our golden shoe, this is a couple of days old by now. Maybe you've seen this. We showed you a photo the other day of Kirby Smart going to a Braves game, kind of down on the field around the batting cage prior to the game when the Braves were taking on the Los Angeles Dodgers. Apparently, while Kirby was there, also doing some work too, a little video support for the Braves, kind of helping them market themselves here a little bit. It's a little different side of Kirby. It's funny. Let me show you this as a part of our golden shoe here right now.
All right, guys, this is your time. This is your moment. This is where you got to be at your best. Right now, you got to be at your best. First group that's got to be great today is the entertainment team. We got to get the crowd into it. We got to be loud. We got to get them loud. Next part of our team we're counting on is the tools. You tools got to be physical. I need flat back and hat speed tonight. Wow! Blooper, you have trained for this. This is your moment. This is your time. When we win tonight, you hold that flag high and you run it out there on the field. And the Braves win! It's at this moment we got to be at our best. Let's go. Let's get out there and get out. Let's go.
So I'm not going to lie to you. There is a part of me that's pretty surprised to see Kirby Smart doing this, but I do appreciate the fact that for as hard driving a guy as Kirby is, and as committed to his own team's success as Kirby is a sports fan. He genuinely likes baseball, a big Atlanta Braves fan, and the fact that I'm assuming out of the goodness of his heart, he just went and did a couple of promos for the Braves. I think that's kind of cool. I like the fact that my coach, and by the way, Todd Hartley's a big Braves. Like, there are a lot of guys on the Georgia staff who are pretty big Braves fans, and as someone who's also a pretty big Braves fan, I really like that a lot. I think that's kind of a fun thing. So it's hard to imagine like Kirby kind of getting into something like that, but when it comes to his favorite baseball team, I reckon Kirby's able to do that, willing to do that. So we will give Kirby a golden shoe right there. I think it's really fun. So I'm glad we were able to share that today. Lousy, stinking Gators. The only thing that's fun about them is kicking them around Jacksonville every fall. How about 1,649 days? That's how long it's been since Florida's beaten Georgia. And I don't care how much preseason hype Florida's getting right now. We don't think that number's going away anytime soon. That is our Gator Hater Updater. You'll have a great day. We'll see you back tomorrow. DawgNation Daily, presented by Breda Pest Management. And on video time now for the R.S. Andrews Cool Down. R.S. Andrews, when you turn to for your air conditioning, heating, plumbing, electric needs, they show up on time. They do the work that's promised, the price promised. You can trust them on all of that today. All right, we'll get a couple of comments in here. Rick Lopez writing in at YouTube says, does Georgia ever schedule home and home outside the SEC? Yeah, Georgia's actually played a good bit of those. Has a lot more schedule for the future. Florida State, Clemson, Ohio State. A lot of these are home and homes in the future. Georgia has played a lot of the sort of single one-off, Chick-fil-A type kickoff games because those are a little easier to schedule and you get some money for playing them. But they do have some homes and home coming up too. Although if the SEC moves to a 9-game conference schedule, honesty compels me to admit I sort of wonder how many of those we're going to see. We've already seen recent cancellation of a series against UCLA, a series against Oklahoma, which was scheduled prior to Oklahoma coming to the SEC. You kind of wonder if we're going to see more of these non-conference cancellations take place. Let's see what else. Jonathan Aaron says, wouldn't you want to be a fly on the wall when Bill Belichick met all the ACC coaches? I bet he and Dabo had an amazing conversation. Yeah, so I guess Belichick was there. Belichick was on SportsCenter yesterday. And I continue to think all of this is really weird for a program like North Carolina that ought to be above weirdness. North Carolina ought to be buttoned up and professional. And in this particular case, I think they've just been revealed to be something other than that. And look, the biggest issue that college athletics has right now is how do you get a little more parity among the various conferences and the programs within those conferences. And I feel like sometimes I'm the only one that seems to notice this. I'm the only one that seems to say this out loud. The biggest issue is a lot of these programs just don't try very hard. They just don't try very hard. All the programs out in, like, say, the old Pac-12, the schools in California, they're all just clown shows. When they canceled football in 2020, they would have stayed canceled for 5 years. Once the Big Ten canceled, they were canceling, and they would have stayed canceled forever. They're just not serious. They're just not serious. And when a North Carolina that from a prestige standpoint, even from a fan base standpoint, I am of the belief, I think many of you are too, that if the SEC could add another school that's not currently in it, UNC would be its first choice. That UNC would have a chance to be an SEC school. UNC would be the next choice, not Clemson, not Florida State. It'd be North Carolina if the SEC really could have its choice, who would join in the future. So this is a team that could play in the big time, and yet they're being publicly embarrassed repeatedly by Bill Belichick. You just got to be more serious than this. You've got to be more professional. You got to, if you want to cash the checks, you got to do something to contribute to the coffers. And a lot of these programs are just not. AP checking in, I guess a Miami fan talking trash about Carson Beck and Jackson Cantwell. And here's the thing, AP. Maybe one day, and I mean this as genuinely as I'm capable of, maybe one day Miami will be a concern for Georgia. But a recruiting battle is not going to create that. And Georgia wasn't planning on Carson Beck being a starting quarterback in 2025 anyway. A transfer portal issue is not going to be that. Miami needs to win games on the field. And if Miami wins games on the field, then there could be a point in time where Georgia has to reckon with that version of Miami. but a recruiting battle is just not it. I promise you. Georgia fans today are thinking about Jackson Cantwell, and they're thinking about, exorbitant NIL, dollar figures. But they're really not thinking that much about Miami. And I know that's hard to hear, but I have an audience that sort of spans a lot of age range. There are a lot of people that watch and listen to our show that are far younger than I am. And I know this is hard, and I'm not intentionally trolling you by telling you this. But to people who are younger than me, they don't have a living memory of Miami being good. Now, I do. I'm old enough to remember Dennis Erickson and Jimmy Johnson. I'm old enough to remember all that. But there is an audience that watches our show. They're in college now, or they're freshly out of college. They don't remember Butch Davis. They don't remember, any of that stuff. They're just simply not old enough to. You have to be in your 30s to remember Miami as a national power. In the era in which they've been in the ACC, Miami has not been nationally relevant whatsoever. There are Georgia fans who've lived their entire lives without thinking anything about Miami. And a recruiting battle alone is not going to cause that to change. So Miami's obviously spending a lot of money. It could be that Miami actually makes an ACC title game, maybe leverages, this lesser league to get into the college football playoff. Maybe it could do what SMU proved capable of doing. And if that happens, then Georgia at that point might be forced to reckon with whatever Miami is. But Georgia doesn't vie for off-season national titles. And so let's see if there's any reason to talk about Miami once we get to the fall. We'll see if that happens. Let's see what else. DMart42 says he appreciated Justice Terry saying it was a business decision. Nobody hates on a kid for it. Just own it. Yeah, I think that Terry is pretty good about that. And in a roundabout way, I think that Jackson Cantwell was somewhat candid with some of his remarks yesterday, too. I just don't think that he or Miami like the idea of going there specifically for money. I think they're concerned about that. Other than that, I actually think that Cantwell was relatively candid yesterday too. But I do get the point you're making about Terry. Zach R., who I guess is also a Miami fan. Boy, we got a lot of Miami fans in here today. Says, I'd love to play Georgia. I think it would be closer than you would care to admit. Maybe it might be. And I mean, Georgia plans on being in the college football playoff this winter. If you want to meet Georgia, that's the easiest place to find them. They're usually there. We'll see if Miami can get there. Keith Finley says they can also go back and watch some old 30 for 30s to see the Miami Hurricanes. That's the case. Gary Roach says he feels that Jackson Cantwell will decommit. Yeah, I mean, I know Mike referenced some version of this too. The truth is that like 5-star offensive tackles are usually the least mobile. I don't mean like on the field. I'm talking about with their recruiting decisions. My guess is the last time we'll ever talk about Cantwell in Georgia was yesterday. 5-star offensive tackles never transfer. They just don't. And while I don't know this for a fact, I'm assuming that he probably signed some – I know it's not National Signing Day till December. My guess is he's going to probably sign some sort of compensation agreement with, I guess, the collective, I reckon, here pretty soon. So, I mean, I believe, even though signing day is not for a few more months, I think Cantwell's recruitment ended yesterday, I believe, because I don't know this for a fact. I'm assuming he probably signed something. Let's see what else. FTW says winning at the highest level starts recruiting at the highest level. Ask Kirby. Yeah, listen, I don't dispute that. And you got 305 in your name. I don't know if that means you're a Miami fan too. Maybe you are. I don't dispute that. Like we're like the one thing if you're new here, we don't sugarcoat stuff. You got to have elite offensive tackles, and right now they're very expensive. Now Georgia may have enough for now, but in the future, the one thing you can't say, and I try to be as honest as I possibly can. I really do. I may, bust chops back and forth a little bit, but I try not to ever come from a dishonest place. I really do. You got to win big recruiting battles for offensive tackle to have the best possible team you can have. Georgia's national championship teams had a first-round presence at tackle. That was Broderick Jones. Other NFL guys, but like a first-round tackle. Kirby, when he first broke through at Georgia, when they made the playoff the first time in 2017, first-round talent at offensive tackle, that was Andrew Thomas. Eventually, it'd also be Isaiah Wilson, but that wasn't until after 2017. You've got to have elite offensive tackles. That it would be a lie, and I try not to lie, at least knowingly. It would be a lie for me to say, man, we don't care about guys that want to be at Georgia. We just want guys who want to be here. Well, in a roundabout way, you can populate your roster, and I do think that Georgia needs to do that, with a bunch of guys who really love being at Georgia. I do think that's a really important thing to do. But you got to have elite offensive tackles. And so if the going rate is $2.5 million, if that stays the going rate, then we'll have to figure that out in a couple of years, all of us in college football. But there will be no sugarcoating from me that maybe Georgia's got enough elite tackles for now, but you're going to have to repopulate that eventually. And if it's a pricey proposition the way that it is now, then you've got to figure that out at the time. No sugarcoating for me on that. Let me go to DawgNation.com for a minute. Let's see what else. Brooke Dawg says Miami's got a lot of issues. NFL Stadium, an hour away from campus. It's a major. Students have issues going to the game. It's no atmosphere at all. Yeah, and they certainly try to sell that as like a pro sports atmosphere. And I'm sure there are plenty of people that do like that. I guess the attendance would suggest not very many, but I'm sure there are plenty of people who do like that. That is not my vibe, though. It's just not. I'll also tell you, as someone who's been to Miami a couple of times, especially for the game against Michigan a couple of years ago, the Orange Bowl against Florida State was kind of an afterthought. But, I mean, I was there for the college football playoff against Michigan. It's a little bit like being out in L.A. for the national title game. You know, that area down there is so spread out. And it really is kind of an international city where you've got a lot of people who kind of, you know, it's like a big F1 race. You know, soccer's a big deal down there. You know, there is definitely a sort of citizen of the world type vibe down there. It's hard for the college football team to cut through the clutter. It really is. I mean, you know, we were down there to see Georgia play Michigan, you know, the biggest deal in our lives. And yet until you got to game day and until you got like 100 yards from the stadium, you would have had a hard time even knowing that the game was taking place. Like, contrast that with Indianapolis, where the national championship game took place a couple of weeks later. That's a city that really cares about college sports, and you couldn't go anywhere without being, like, inundated with, hey, we're the side of the national championship game. Everybody who's here's for the national championship. And the Miami people would be like, well, that's Indianapolis. You know, we're a cool town. Indianapolis is not. I'm sure most people think that Miami's cooler than Indianapolis. I don't dispute that. But that, to me, is just not college football. It's just not. And I do think Miami, as the program, has had a hard time finding its footing within Miami, the city. And it seems like the Marlins struggle with a little bit of that too. I think the Heat have even struggled some with that. You know, the Dolphins seem to have the legacy franchise. They seem to have a little bit of a built-in fan base. But that's a weird place from a sports standpoint. I would say that Atlanta used to be a little bit like that. I don't think that Atlanta is quite as much like that anymore. I think Atlanta as a sports town has kind of gotten better. I think Atlanta's become a better sports town. When I was in Miami, the times that I've been there, especially for the Georgia-Michigan game, great weather, a lot to do, endless array of things to do. But I didn't really find myself being a part of a community that was just like overwhelmed with its love for sports, nor overwhelmed with its love for the Hurricanes. Maybe that was just my perception. Matt Rickovita says, one of my coworkers' son was just invited to come visit Georgia. It's Amari Sykes, the class of 2027 outside linebacker. I'll be doing my best to steer him in the right direction. Matt, that's awesome news. Please pass along our congratulations on that. That's really good stuff. Really good stuff. I'm happy to hear that. Savannah Bryan says Miami's not even been relevant in a weaker ACC. They would be Mississippi State in the SEC. I mean, in all honesty, part of the reason that the ACC has become a lesser league is because they brought in Miami to be a standard bearer, and Miami never was successful in doing that. Savannah Bryan says, this is an interesting point. He says, I don't like the idea of a 9-game conference schedule because I don't think the SEC will allow us to have – I have thought about this too. Georgia plays in Jacksonville every year. We don't think that's going away. And so what he says is they're not going to give us 4 home games, 4 away games, plus a neutral every year. They're not going to do that. He says, I bet we would have 6 one year and 3 the next. I don't trust the SEC office in any way. So here's what's interesting about that, because I have thought about all of this. Because it would be awesome if going to 9 meant you got guaranteed 4 home, 4 away every year plus the 1. That'd be a pretty good deal. I'm sort of like you that I don't quite feel like they'll do that for Georgia. But keep in mind, the same way that Georgia, Florida is not going anywhere, I don't believe Texas, Oklahoma in Dallas is going anywhere either. So I think, have a little bit of a suspicion that they won't treat Georgia well when it comes to whatever. But it would stand to reason that whatever Georgia, Florida gets, Texas, Oklahoma gets as well. And we see them bending over backwards to sort of meet Texas' needs all the time. So maybe that increases the chances you could get to 4-4-1. I think if you did go 4-4-1, if you're a Georgia fan, you'd have to be pretty happy about that, I think. But I'm like Brian, the chance of that really happening may not be great. He wants him to go to 10 conference games. I think I said this the other day when it became, a very strong possibility they were going to the 9 conference games. I think 9 is better than 8 in almost every way. I really do. I am pro 9-game conference schedule. But I was also pro expanded playoff, and that's turned out to be a disaster. So maybe don't take my words on this too much. Senior Dawg 54 said, I had a doctor's appointment in Alabama about 2 weeks after we beat them in Indianapolis. I had on every piece of Georgia apparel you can imagine, got real quiet in that waiting room. Good for you, Senior Dawg. I love that. Baruch Dawg says, I see college sports dying in the near future. It'll end up like the European model where each pro team has an academy where they sign players to as young as 13. College sports will be for the athletes left behind and the late bloomers. I do get that. And I do think there's a strong possibility that all of this just goes away. It could happen. But I feel less likely that will happen now than I have in a good number of years. I really do. And the reason why I feel that way is, let's use the Jackson Cantwell thing as an example of this. The fact that they don't feel super comfortable, whether it be Cantwell or Miami, they don't feel super comfortable talking about the financial figure on this, that kind of leads you to believe where it did come from. Because who does benefit the most from that number being public? I think that gives you an idea of where that leak may have come from. But once again, the fact that the NIL figure seems a little unseemly. It's like, do you really want to have $2.5 million attached to your name? Do you really want to have $2.5 million suggested as your payout for a player? I think that sort of hints at public opinion is not really on the side of let's turn this into professional sports. Public opinion's not in favor of this. And so therefore, when public opinion strongly lines up around one idea, for better or worse, politicians notice. And I do believe that politicians in some form or fashion are the solution here. And I think that's true no matter who you vote for. I really do. Because the ultimate truth is, and I saw somebody wrote this the other day, this is probably true, is that the politicians in a given state are a lot more likely to line up around the interests of those fans in the state than they are their party affiliation. And that's as close as we're going to come talk about. This is not going to be like the red people versus the blue people for the future of college athletics. This is going to be the politicians from the college athletic states, the states where college athletics really matter, against the people from the big cities. That's what it's going to come down to. And that's not all just one party versus another. It's just not. I think because public opinion, I think, is really starting to coalesce around an idea of we want college sports to look like college sports. I think public opinion is starting to coalesce here. I think the politicians are going to notice that. I really do. I really do. Savannah Bryant says Savannah Bryant, who's a great commenter, has become very cynical about certain things, the Atlanta Braves included. He says, I think it's funny that you think Texas and Georgia would get equal treatment. But they would have to give them the same. I mean, they can't not do that, right? They can't give Georgia, Florida one agreement and then Texas and Oklahoma a completely different scheduling model. If they do, I guess we'll be getting the war paint on, I guess. But that's funny. UJ Marine says there have been mutterings of Texas, Oklahoma moving to Jerry World. City of Dallas keeps kicking in tons of money to keep it, and eventually will hit the wall. Yeah, because right now that game's played at the old school Cotton Bowl. That's interesting. I don't know enough about the climate around there to know how much do fans really love the game being at the state fair. Like, is that a big deal? Like, I don't know enough about that culture to know how much that really matters. It seems like to me from afar, the Jerry World situation is one of those deals where it's a massive stadium. It's basically become like American landmark. It's a big deal, but it seems like from an atmosphere standpoint, probably not as good as the old Texas Stadium. It seems like a lot of Cowboys fans now just sort of sell their tickets. It's not a huge home field advantage for the Cowboys anymore, the best that I can tell. I'd be a little curious to know what the feeling of Texans about Jerry World actually is. Let me get some Facebook comments. On Facebook. Matt Rugavino also pointing out we were going to talk about this the other day, and I don't think we ever did. Another example, and I'm glad that Matt brought this up because we were going to do a thing about this on the show and just end up not. Is that the other day on like TNT or whatever, Charles Barkley made a big thing about how he won't donate to Auburn for NIL. Now, as a Georgia fan, you can kind of laugh at that a little bit because Barkley, very famous guy, one of the most famous people on sports TV, being an Auburn alumnus is a pretty big selling point for them typically. But when he goes on TV, he's like, I don't care about their NIL at all. I'm not giving any money for that. Kind of a little bit of a dent on the Auburn mystique a bit, which we kind of enjoy. But as Matt points out, this is also another example of, Barkley's a little bit of a sort of a shoot from the hip guy. Barkley just sort of says the first thing that pops into his head, for better or worse, just sort of calls it like he sees it, kind of shooting from the hip. And that's a guy, sort of a, kind of plain spoken, regular dude sort of type mindset. He's like, I don't like NIL. Like, I'm just telling you right now, public opinion is rising up against this. The only people who want college athletics to be lawless anarchy are, for the most part, people with postgraduate degrees that live in places like Northern Virginia and Westchester County, New York, and these very like erudite suburbs of big cities in the Atlantic seaboard. It's a small sliver of America who thinks that, hey, yeah, college athletics should just be torn apart by, lawless anarchy. Average, regular people, I don't think they have a huge issue with players getting paid. Frankly, probably aware that players may have gotten paid, at least theoretically, for a very long time. But they don't think to use a double negative, they don't think there should be no rules. They think there should be some rule structure around this. And I think that's becoming more and more popular. UGA Marine says the Cotton Bowl Stadium's so bad they quit playing high school games there, which is funny. I didn't quite realize that. Although I've seen some of those Texas high school stadiums. They are outrageous. Outrageous. We have a few of those in Georgia now, but boy, some of those Texas ones are crazy. Let's see what else. Brian Whitaker and Kent Holcomb talking about, Iglesias as the Braves closer. Here's the thing about, like, bullpens in Major League Baseball. Is for the most part, from year to year, it's pretty erratic. I know there's a lot of famous gamblers that have made a lot of money betting on baseball, and they'll tell you that when they're making their projections, like when they're putting their, like, numbers together, they assume that every Major League team has a league average bullpen. They don't make preseason projections about bullpens because from year to year, it's up, it's down for the units collectively, for the players individually. And it could just be that Iglesias just ain't what he was last year because that happens a lot when it comes to these guys. That's one of the reasons why, spending a bunch of money on a bullpen arm is usually a pretty risky proposition because from year to year, you don't really know what you're going to get. Although Kent pointing out that Spencer Strider, Ronald Acuna also looks like they're getting ready to come back. I know Ronnie's getting ready to play in Gwinnett. The Strider thing is, to be honest, pretty weird, but maybe he's on his way back too. And what we said was, I think we said this even during this show, although we're not supposed to be talking about baseball, but sometimes we do. What we said was, hey, early start to the year, can Atlanta just tread water until these guys come back? Well, now sitting flat-footed 500, you kind of have treaded water. And at the top of the lineup, Acuna could be the thing that sort of unlocks the potential of the rest of them. I don't know why Atlanta, even without Acuna, is hitting so much worse than it did just 2 seasons ago. I really don't fully understand all of that. But maybe Acuna's return could spark some of that. Not to say be as good as they were in 2023, but just be better than they've been. All right. Let's see a few more things. Matt Riccovino mentioned, I think we briefly said this one day this week, that Zach Calzada is still playing college football. He's one of the Kentucky quarterbacks right now. It's crazy to think. He's been out. I mean, a lot of these guys, they just play forever now, I guess. All right. Kent Johnson cheering, as he says, go you big dogs. We like that. Let me go back to YouTube for a minute. We'll get a couple more and get ready to wrap up. FTW says, Mario Cristobal does whatever it takes to get a kid. He's a recruiter. Right now it takes money. Get your coins up. So there you go. Miami fans feeling very good here today. Although I think it's worth pointing out that I don't think Cristobal even knew about this until it was final. So the whole notion of he does whatever it takes, I think that he sits there and waits to be told who's going to get a chance to play for him, at least based on, direct sourcing there on that. I actually think that Cristobal is probably a pretty good coach. I do. I would say just make sure you don't run a running play when you could take a knee. I would say that. But I think there's a chance he's probably a pretty good coach. I hope he gets a chance to prove that. Just be careful with Syracuse. The only thing I'm going to tell you is be careful with Syracuse. Syracuse will sneak up on you if you're not careful. Be careful with them. Tough stuff asking there. Yes, there will be Before the Hedges tonight. More insight from kind of behind the scenes in Nixa, Missouri earlier this week. Jerry Dawg fan wondering how the other Miami linemen feel about a newcomer making $2.5 million. Yeah, man, I think it's a fair question. I do, and I think for the most part, athletes do understand hierarchies better than maybe the average person does. Athletes are pretty used to hierarchies, and hierarchies are just a natural occurring phenomenon in life. You can't do anything to eliminate them. They're just going to exist. But obviously, you got to be. If you're a coach, acting as a GM, you want your best players making the most money. You just do. And if that's not the case, then things get a little tricky. I think that's fair. Boy, we got a lot of Miami fans in here today. You love that. You love that. I think there may be more Miami fans in our chat right now than at Hard Rock Stadium, at least in the games I've seen in recent years. It's kind of cool. That's awesome. And by the way, who's our guy of all the Miami people? Our guy Dennis, who is here a lot. I don't even think he's here today, unless I just don't see him. Yeah, funny stuff. All right, let me get a final DawgNation.com or two, and we'll get out of here. And to the Miami people, we're here every day, so come back and join us tomorrow. I know. You know, there's always these like little things that happen where when you experience a different culture, they're just things that you're just not used to. And I think for a lot of Miami people, you know, history began yesterday because they got Jackson Cantwell. But we actually are here talking about Georgia football every single day because thankfully, you know, we've been close to a program that has been relevant every single day now, going back. This is our 10th year doing the show. So we'd love to have you come back and join us tomorrow. We're always here, unlike Miami. Bill Camacho checking out. Glad to have you here, Bill. Thanks for being here. Anything else? Yeah, okay, we're getting ready to wrap it up here today. So good stuff as always. And as we said, Before the Hedges tonight, presented by Kroger, Jeff Sintel, Kaylee Manziel. More recruiting talk there on that. Also, hope you're all getting ready for a great afternoon. Look forward to seeing you back here tomorrow. By the way, if you want your afternoon to be great, don't get ruined by some sort of plumbing emergency or something like that. Trust our friends at RS Andrews. You know, the RS stands for rapid service. So if a pipe bursts or if your water heater goes out, in many cases, RS Andrews can show up same day, replace the water heater, get the plumbing emergency solved. That's what they're all about, story after story. They've been delivering smiles, and they can deliver a smile for you. So find them online at rsandrews.com. Have a good day. Back tomorrow, DawgNation Daily, presented by Breda Pest Management. By the way, just 2 more shows after today, of course, left in this studio, and then we'll be at the new studio for good starting on Monday, at least we think. So interesting stuff on that. Have a good day. Back tomorrow, DawgNation Daily, presented by Breda Pest Management. We will look forward to talking to you then.